Okay, thank you, Tara. Now I'm seeing so many of you are in my studio. Put up your hands if you're in the 3A studio, just so I can know. Yeah, the majority of you is. Okay, so some of the stuff I'm going to try to fly through a few slides because you've heard me speak a little bit about Indigenous peoples in the city recently. So first of all, thanks to Jane and Tara for the great lecture series they're organizing and for the invitation. It's always interesting to be a speaker in your own school, which is a little bit different. And I guess what I want to talk about tonight is a kind of personal reflection and research trajectory for the next 5 to 7 years of mine, in a position of kind of thinking about what a lot of the work that I do means and what it means moving forward. And it comes down to this question of critical relationalism, which I'm going to get into today a little bit. And I'm going to focus on that because I don't think you guys have heard that. And I was thinking about earlier, I've spoken at probably at least a dozen universities over the last year on this stuff. So it's interesting. I'm like, tonight's the cutoff. After Waterloo, I don't want to give public talks about this anymore. But it's nice to be able to be here with students and colleagues to share some of these thoughts. So in the context of this lecture series, this talk kind of evolves from my own reflections on the word studio, especially it's good for those of you that are in studio with me now. And looking at the history of the word studio, which actually has a lot of colonial baggage with it, and thinking about, is studio the right environment to learn how to design? And so it's something that I'm continually thinking about, and I'm challenging a lot of different words. And out of this, there's a couple of different words that I've been thinking about recently. One is climate. And thinking about, Jalia gave many of you the lecture today. We are looking at climate change diagrams. And if you do a web search for what climate is, this is the kind of stuff that comes up, right? It's metrics, hotspots, temperature rising, all of those things. But, the etymology of that is, I think, quite interesting, that the root word of climate comes from this idea of horizontal zone of the Earth's surface measured by lines parallel to the equator. And so it's part of this history of defining regions by drawing abstract lines over the Earth, actually is the root word of what climate is. So finding zones and through a kind of measurement techniques. And that's got like a really problematic history in Canada of abstractly applying things like grids over land and then monetizing those and valuing them. This is near where I'm from. My sister lives in North Battleford, but this is a very strong Métis territories here. In the States, it's the Jeffersonian grid. Here, it's the Dominion grid. And when you treat land like that, you start to you survey it, you quantify it, and then suddenly you realize that there's stuff like resources underneath that are like really valuable. And then you figure out methods through the law to add cost to that. And you start to think about the land as something that you make money off of. And this leads to obviously gold rushes and oil rushes, and now this crazy idea of Canada as a very large faucet for people in the United States. This is a dam in, I don't know if you guys are even familiar with this. I feel like a lot of Canadians don't even know the Site C Dam in northern BC that recently was completed, and they have flooded the valley now. This is the Peace River, right near where my Métis family live, and they've pretty much destroyed an entire ecosystem of this river for $12 billion to generate power. So that's what happens when you treat land as something that's there for our use, and it's a very different positionality than when you think of the land as Mother Earth. And this is just a painting by Christy Belcourt. I've got a print in my living room at home, one of my favorite paintings of hers, and it's called Reverence for Life. It's got a similar Christy Belcourt theme to it. But what I want to share here, and just as a provocation for you all, is that when Indigenous people, and Penny mentioned this in her land acknowledgement, talk about the land as Mother Earth, it's not like a metaphor of like, it's just a nice way to talk about the planet. It literally means your mother, like something that gives you sustenance. And this is a positionality. The love that you feel for your mother, hopefully most of you feel love for your mothers, the feeling you get when you see your mom and you can give her a big hug, that's how you should be feeling about the land. It's the same feeling, right? And if you think of land as a quantifiable, abstracted thing that we have to manage, you'll put a dam in because you're going to justify it on its carbon footprint. You know, well, that's better than fossil fuels, so I guess this makes sense. The Ottawa River, they did this so many times they've wiped out the Pamisi species, very sacred sea species that went up and down, migrates up and down the entire east coast of Turtle Island. You know, you put so many of those in there, so you can justify that from a climate change perspective, but would you put something into your mother's main artery that may actually lead to her death? Right? So it's a positionality on the choices that you choose to make in life and how you do it. There's a great, well, not a great book. There's a book on Native American architecture. And I always remember jumping on this one sentence in that book. It said, Native Americans had no other choice than to use the materials around them, i.e. sticks and bent wood and those sorts of things. Do you think that Native American people or Indigenous people didn't know that there were minerals inside rocks? You know, copper's been used for hundreds and thousands of years by First Nations people. The Ojibwe people have used it all over. That was a distinct choice. They just were choosing not to extract it in mass quantities, right? So this idea that people don't have choices in their relations to land is a question of positionality to me. So I think also what I want to talk about tonight is this idea of climate and crisis. And again, I always do this with almost everything, looking up what words mean. You know, critical, on one hand, is the nature of a crisis, in extreme doubt or danger, and on the other side, it's involving judgment as to the truth or merit of something. So these have very different contexts, and we use them a lot in architecture school. On the left is this idea of a crisis. What's going on? What creates a crisis? Well, I think your generation is getting bombarded with crises, so many to the point that you're almost getting numb to the idea of crises everywhere around you, right? This is a crisis in relations, a crisis in our human-to-human relationships. This is also a crisis, and this is a crisis in our human-to-more-than-human relationships. These are both crises, and you guys are having to deal with them all the time as design students. The other side, the other way we use this is what makes something critical. This is the judgment as to the truth or merit of something, having the knowledge or ability of this. So this is something you've been taught most of your lives, I hope, is to be a critical thinker. People start teaching you that in high school, right? What does that mean, to be a critical thinker? Well, first it means in grade school that you get slapped on your hand if you write an essay in first person. You're not allowed to do that, right? Stop doing that. You're not allowed to use your personal feelings in essay, right? It must be objective. Critical theory, a very strong part of most academic institutions around the world, and this is a very dumbed down version of this, but a theory is critical to the extent that it seeks human emancipation to liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. So the idea is kind of this Archimedean point in critical theory that you should be able to remove yourself from your context and look back at it objectively and criticize it, analyze it, think critically about where you are. It makes sense, right? Critical theory comes out of the Frankfurt School. You've got kind of an interwar generation of thinkers and philosophers within Nazi Germany saying, geez, maybe we should think critically about what's going on here. So those are all reasons for this, and it's not a bad thing. But for many Indigenous people, I call it an inherent conundrum of criticality. So for many academic people, you don't put up your family photos very often. You will see it with Indigenous speakers here and there, right? I'm not going to share too much about my family, but you know what I have learned over the years from my Indigenous elders and teachers is that you never speak objectively. You always are, your ancestors are speaking through you. Today I'm here, I speak through my ancestors. So that idea of critical objectivity, of each of our individual paths not mattering, that's a bit of a conundrum for Indigenous people, many Indigenous people, right? Like all of our individual histories and who we are and where we come from, those are important. That frames who we are and how we position ourselves in the world. So these are just images I might have shared with some of you guys before, but you know, my architectural career was often very far removed from who I was growing up, actually, in the Canadian prairies. You know, I worked for a big design firm in Calgary. That's a $15 million house for a family of 4 on the left. That was the last project I did when I left for my PhD. And then in my early academic work, I spent a lot of time in Kenya and South America, in the favelas and informal settlements in Kenya. And really I'm trying to unpack what this meant, right? How did we end up in a place as a species where this is okay, this level of disparity? And I haven't quite figured it all out yet. But it kind of brought me back to questioning my own role and what did it mean to be a Métis architect. So this is over a decade ago now that I did a research project asking that. What does that mean to be a Métis architect, right? What does that mean to bring my personhood into my practice? And I was part of a time where, you know, Indigenous design wasn't really much of a part of discourse in Canada, quite frankly, but today it's all changed. And these slides you guys have seen before. Indigenous is kind of in. Every library, every municipal project, hospitals, even a penitentiary project I'm advising on, everybody wants to talk about Indigenous design. But this is the part that, and I've shared this with you guys before, I'm going to read it again. This is the thing that haunts me still in my own work. This is a Hawaiian thinker, Pokaloani, writing about the 5th stage of colonization. So this is when Indigenous people have been assimilated and basically wiped out. He says, the traditional culture that simply refuses to die or go away is now transformed into the culture of the dominating colonial society. Indigenous art that has survived may gain in popularity and form the basis for economic exploitation. Indigenous symbols and print may decorate modern dress. Indigenous musical instruments may be incorporated into modern music. Supporting Indigenous causes within the general colonial structure may become the popular political thing to do, exploiting the culture further. This exploitation may be committed by Indigenous as well as non-Indigenous people. So it's this funny space that we're all in, you know, and I really appreciated Penny's traditional land acknowledgement today, because this question of when does it become tokenistic and how do I engage in this conversation myself as a guest in the territories where I live as well. These are big questions, and I think we have to continue reflecting on them. So I want to now kind of jump to this question of thinking about the root word of climate and regions and borders between things, and thinking about in Canada and architectural design culture. And this is kind of, a lot of this stuff has inspired this new research agenda that I'm on, thinking about regional versus relational. You know, now we've got a different identity crisis because our country's under threat, but for First Nations peoples here, this isn't the first time that someone's threatened to take land. You know, the country had an identity crisis in the 20th century. 1911, they're still trying to figure out what the flag was. The big argument was, well, should it be British or should it be more French, right? The identity crisis reached a peak in the 1940s and 50s after World War II to find out who Canada was as a nation. So they sent a commission across the country, the Massey Commission. Everybody's heard of Vincent Massey, right? Massey Hall, he's a hero of Canada. Where they actually went on a commission across Canada, met with communities and asked people what it meant to be Canadian and what would this mean for Canadian arts in particular. So the Canada Council for the Arts emerges out of this. A lot of the arts buildings that comes out. In the 1960s, 900 buildings were built following the Massey Commission with this questioning of who is Canada as a country. Years later, and I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but in the context of asking what is Canada, there were people that were talking about a movement in architectural critical regionalism. If you guys put up your hands if in a class you've talked about critical regionalism. Yeah, so it's not really as topical anymore, I'm finding out, but in the 80s this was a big deal. And all it was in a nutshell was to say a white Le Corbusian box doesn't make sense in Africa the same way that it's built in the United States or in England or in Japan, right? That people were kind of growing out of this idea of international modernism and saying, well, architects need to respond to the climate and the region where they build. Makes sense, right? This is part of your education. But at the time, it wasn't, you know, it was a very Miesian time where everyone was just trying to do Miesian buildings all around the world. Brian McKay Lyons, who's one of our most famous regional architects in Canada, says that Kenneth Frampton's critical regionalist thesis enabled our resistance in the face of numbing cultural influence of globalization. The thing about it, though, is that critical regionalism came from a certain positionality. In the 1960s, Frampton was actually an editor at Architectural Design magazine, where he was very focused on this question of modern architecture in peripheral situations. But what does Frampton mean when he's talking about the periphery? Because if you're talking about periphery, you're talking about a center, right? So I'm pretty sure that Maori people never think of themselves on the periphery of anything, right? I'm pretty sure that people in Japan don't think of themselves as in the periphery. But Frampton became obsessed with people like Tadao Ando, right? Because he was doing modernism in Japan, right? In a kind of regionalist way. And all of the people that he wrote about all of those years were Glenn Murcutt in Australia, the Pat Cows and Brian McKay Lyons, all these critical regionalist architects. So in Canada, you think about what would that mean towards a critically Canadian regionalism, right? Well, yeah, the Pat Cows and Brian McKay Lyons have been the most celebrated critical regionalists. If you back up a step, though, back to the Commission in 1951 when they published this is directly a quote from the Massey Report. It is argued that the Indian arts emerged naturally from that combination of religious practices and economic and social customs which constituted the culture of the tribe and the region. The impact of the white man with his more advanced civilization and his infinitely superior techniques resulted in the gradual destruction of the Indian way of life. So I've actually raised this with the RAIC, that they gave their second gold medal ever to Vincent Massey, and this was in his report. It's a very racist document. They make some space that, the arts and crafts, they're still, Indigenous people might be applicable in arts and crafts environments, but in terms of contemporary practice of art and design moving forward, they had essentially been wiped out. That was the position in the 1950s. So when you think back to what does it mean to be a critical thinker, critical to the extent that it seeks human emancipation from the circumstances that enslave them. The only thing that the critical regionalists hated more than international modernism was postmodernism. And I won't go into that too much, but postmodernism, aside from its very ugly, quirky results, was very interested in this idea that architecture means something, that it has cultural relevance. So postmodernists were trying to respond to the kind of white box by saying, what does symbolism mean to people? Does it, we should have relationships with buildings that mean something to us, to our histories. They have stories to them to tell. They're not just a black steel box that looks really nice, right? What happened to the history of that? Well, Indigenous people are often packaged in with that. And even today, some of the Indigenous design work people will say is postmodern in a sense because it's trying to be too narrative-based, right? Frampton would call that populist. He calls it populism. So I'm just going to read the last one where this author is critiquing this part of critical regionalism. He's talking about Tadao Ando doesn't really design with traditional Japanese building strategies, construction, that sort of thing. Same thing with Charles Correa in India or Louis Barragan. These are people that had knowledge of international modernism and were adapting it into place, but it wasn't like a grassroots from their culture's architecture, actually. It was more like an adaptation of international modernism. So he ends by asking at the bottom, we might begin by raising a series of questions that are often asked by scholars of nationalism and post-colonialism. What are the constituents of cultural or regional or national identity? How and by whom are the answers to these questions decided? And what are the implications of these decisions having been made? I think that in Canada, the Massey Report had immense implications for the decisions that were made in terms of our design culture. And it kept Indigenous peoples out of it for the next 50 or 60 years. But today, critical regionalism is kind of back on the agenda given the climate crisis. So, these authors in Architectural Review said Frampton's engaged theory of the discipline is more important than ever. And the architecture needs a renewed frame of values in which the ground's topographic and political nature is fully recognized. And I like that they put and political nature. This starts to get to what critical regionalism missed out on. They still were treating the topography of the land as a blank canvas for a really good architect to go and do fancy, great architecture, right? But with full erasure of the Indigenous people and the cultural histories of those places, right? You can do a beautiful, you can do a beautiful log contemporary building in Banff and totally ignore the fact that First Nations and Métis people were murdered and removed out of Banff because they didn't really fit the postcard image of what Banff was supposed to be, right? We have those legacies, and people are not gone. These communities are still here, and they're still thriving. So what is the relationship? And I'm not saying I have all the answers, but it's important. So I'm coming up on I'll try to wrap this up in some ways. I've been teaching a few studios. Some of you may know I'm looking at Canadian embassies abroad, and so I've been dabbling here and there with different kinds of research, and one was International Studies Quarterly. But I came across this paper, and its title just smacked me in the face a few years ago. And I thought, that's the question. That's the question you're all struggling with. It's this question I struggle with, right? In the world of crises bombarding you, and you're having to deal with everything in the world that you can think of. How do you prioritize which crises to deal with and in which order? That's a really, really important question. And in this, this is the paper where I don't know if they coined the term. I feel like they coined this term. They talk about putting forth an account of critical relationalism. And I thought that is the question, thinking about critical regionalism. How could critical regionalism mature and evolve today and to factor in these issues? And just read through this. They're obviously not talking about architecture, but think in relation to the Massey report and sort of contemporary global practice. It says, previous relational approaches have not sufficiently problematized their epistemological commitments, how they know which relations matter in any given instance. Or alternatively, what knowledge do they rely on when thinking about relations? This is problematic because if we do not become epistemically relational, then we fall into the trap of contextual visions, even if they're relational. So the specificity of particular relations and knowledge, we reproduce relations of inequality with the denial of its ramifications on the urban centers of the West as the grounds for racial capitalism. It matters who conceptualizes the reactions we center in our analyses, our worlds, and thus which corners and issues of the world we see and problematize. They end their paper by basically saying, talking about Indigenous peoples, their starting points, the relations they call out, should be our starting points. And this is, I think, pretty important, and when we think about education and design culture. I'm just going to quickly, I've already showed you guys the cultural iceberg, so I'm going to just share these quotes, and then I'm going to fly through the other ones in like a minute. I published an essay a few years ago called The Design Lodge, and I start off with these. This is from the former dean of Yale in 2013. He said, I used to think the top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy, and to deal with these we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that. And I often say, you can cross out scientists and put architects in there pretty easily, or planners, or engineers, or any other profession working around with us. Everybody gets a little bit uncomfortable in their seats when we talk about this kind of thing. And yet, what is this, 45 years ago, more than 45 years ago, Douglas Cardinal was writing, we have something in our way of life and our roots that is a knowledge that surpasses that of the majority society. They have lost their affinity with the environment while we still feel the oneness of all living beings, the oneness of all life. We have a tremendous amount of knowledge to offer mankind, and we must teach industrial societies the meaning of life. So I've showed you guys this. I'm not going to go over it. I think probably Kelsey's familiar with this. This idea of the cultural iceberg, I'll just run through it. I'm not going to run through that. Talking about how buildings express cultures and the perversity of conventional, let's say, I think we're growing out of this very quickly now, which is great, but traditionally this idea of a total mismatch, an alienation between buildings and places, including our parliament building sitting on unceded, unsurrendered territory of Algonquin people. So one of the things that I've argued is that this should be called the Embassy of Canada, because I don't know whose land they're claiming. There's no treaty relationship with Algonquin people. It's in someone else's territory. So you guys have seen these. I showed these to you. I did and for those that haven't seen this, I did an exercise in AI looking at, what is Indigenous design. You could, in about 8-9 minutes, I designed 16 different Indigenous buildings. And what does that tell me when I ask this question? What is Indigenous design in today's culture? What's going on here? And what's happening and what's worrisome is you're getting the expression of a culture being dislodged from its epistemological foundations. It might look Indigenous in some cases, but at the bottom of that iceberg means a relationship to the natural world. And that's that spiritual, loving relationship that the elders all talk about. And if that gets dislodged by capitalism and individualism and unfettered resource extraction, if we can't spiritually connect with the land anymore collectively, we're in trouble. It's turned into a commodity. So in a lot of my thinking about climate and climate change and what I'm interested in is looking again at how we teach architecture has to be revisited in a fairly significant way. I think it's going to help us navigate some of this. So I'm going to just wrap up by saying that I hope you guys will take this phrase that I've borrowed from those authors to say, you know, in your lives and in your lives as designers and your careers moving forward, how do you determine what relations matter? And you guys are doing a good exercise on that right now in studio. How do you prioritize the right things? And I'll end there. Thank you very much. I'm very, very keen to hear Kelsey speak, so thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you. Hard act to follow. I think that's why David set it up that way. But no, it's really good to be able to have this conversation this evening, and I largely see that or this evening as an exercise in that practice of a conversation and thinking about how these big ideas can be put into practice. Because as David was saying earlier, we have this multiplicity of crises facing us every day, and that can be very overwhelming and very anxiety-inducing. And what I often like to say, as you alluded to on your slides as well, is we don't have a climate crisis, we have a human crisis. And I think that comes back to that question that you ended with, which is we have this human crisis because we don't know, or we have forgotten how to be in relation with one another, to know what relationships to value and why to value them, both those that are human, but also those relationships that might be with more than human beings, with our non-human kin. And so hopefully a little bit of what I will share tonight is some of my reflections on that from my own positionality as a Shinnecock person. So let's get into that. I'm from the Shinnecock Nation, enrolled citizen. Our territory is located on the east end of what's currently known as Long Island, New York. So that is what you are seeing here. It's half the island if you're not as astute with geography. It is a very long island, hence the name. And so our traditional territory is this eastern portion of it. What you're not seeing on here is the western portion, which includes the county of Nassau, as well as 2 boroughs of the city of New York. And so we're a coastal First Nation. We're directly impacted by climate change, as you will see in just a moment. But what we are also known for is being traditionally whalers, great still to this day, fishers and bay people. But we're also known for our harvesting and carving of wampum. Have folks heard of wampum before? Show of hands. Good, like that. How many haven't heard of wampum before? It's okay, you can raise your hand. Okay, good. So I often trace my journey here in the same vein as a wampum bead. So how many folks, let's see, you can just shout it out. What is wampum? Is it a stone? It's a shell, thank you. Not very many people in this part of the world know that, I've come to learn. But where I come from, we dig for these mollusk relatives. We then eat everything inside of them, and then their shells get carved into what you all know and see as wampum beads, which are pictured here. And those are the shells. It comes from what's called a quahog and a whelk. The white and purple come from different types of mollusks that grow in our waters. And these beads are then made into the treaty belts that constitute our first treaties in this part of the world. So things like the 2-row wampum, the dish with 1 spoon wampum, and many, many more, hundreds of wampum belt agreements that were made throughout North America and particularly the Great Lakes. But these mollusks, these quahogs, these whelks, they don't grow here. They don't live here. So wampum in and of itself speaks to a very storied relationship and relationality across regions, across territories, across nations. And I hope in just a small bit of what I do in the world contributes to that connection and longevity and relationality. So diving in a little bit more to what we saw on the map previously is my home territory. So again, traditionally, it was that whole eastern portion of Long Island, which is a very large landscape and territory. Due to colonization and genocide and illegal land usurpations, we are now reduced to what you see here, which is called, well, 2 parcels. What you see here, about a 900-acre parcel known as our Shinnecock territory. So this is our ancestral unceded territory, still within our jurisdiction and control. When you enter this territory, you are no longer in the United States of America, or what's currently known as the United States of America. We also have another parcel on another portion of the island that you can't see here. That's called our Westwoods territory. But I want to focus in on this particular parcel because it is the area that we currently have most of our tribal citizenry living on, and it's also directly impacted by climate change. The whole island is, to be frank, but I think this particular area, you'll see the impact in large part because it is a peninsula. So again, surrounded on most sides, not all, by water. So this is from the NASA sea level, NASA and NOAA sea level rise simulator from satellite imagery. And this is projections of what our territory will face in light of rising sea levels in regards to climate change and climatic changes over the next, I'll share with you in just a moment. The colors indicate different levels of severity, but over about the next 15 to 100 years. Give or take how much we want to emit, and you know, as the current administration of the United States like to say, drill baby drill. So with that, yellow is the most severe form of inundation, flooding of lands and territory. And as you can see, the peninsula is our current Shinnecock territory, but all of Long Island is impacted. If you zoom out, all of the eastern seaboard is, as you will see in just a moment. So under these high-level projections, if we have the yellow severity, which is projected for about 50 to 70 years out, that'll be about 6.9 feet of sea level rise, as you'll see in a minute from some of the modeling predictions. That would be a loss of about 2/3 of our reservation territory today. If we are under sort of the minimal projections, like don't change a thing, everything stays as normal right now, we're at the red level of inundation. And so we are currently facing a climate crisis, a land crisis, and a human crisis for our nation and for many areas of neighboring territories surrounding us. So a study by COP and many others, the IPCC, I also served on the New York State Climate Change Assessment. These numbers are corroborated by unfortunately, many different modelers and predictions. But on the nice end, we are likely to see sea levels rise in our region by as much as 6.9 feet. And right now, we're seeing those rising sea levels already with the probably next 15 years or so at about, probably about 1 meter of rise. Now, one of the things that I like to tell people about sea level rise and our nation and many of the indigenous nations along the Atlantic seaboard is that's not something that's new to us. So we have stories within our knowledge systems that trace our existence to the outer continental shelf when that wasn't flooded, when that wasn't filled with water. We have burial sites there, we had fishing sites, and there was this way in which over thousands of years ago, we interacted with living with water, with living with rising seas, with living with fluctuations in how water came into our being and everyday lives. What we're seeing now, though, that I like to highlight for folks is the frequency of change. So what you see here in this graph is that the rate of sea level rise is growing so exponentially that we don't have time to adapt. And more so than that, we also have issues around how our planning policy, our environmental policy, our laws around buildings and zoning have confined us to largely, as you'll hear towards the end of the talk, spoiler alert, drown in place. That's the policy we've created. So, what do we do about it? Well, some of the potential impacts that we're seeing for sea level rise along the Atlantic coast, and for those that are less aware, I love seeing the cultural iceberg. Just a little shout out to Marissa. I love Marissa. I didn't really know that I was surprised to see that was her work, which is so cool. But I know her and her husband and her baby and her family, and they are amazing. So if you didn't catch that, Marissa Manitowabi was the Indigenous cultural iceberg. But for those, and she is from the Seneca Nation, so just on the other side of the imagined border, based out of Buffalo, and done some really amazing work with maintaining Haudenosaunee cultural arts and design. And so for those that are less aware, these are some of our tribal nations along the Atlantic coast that are right now being directly impacted by sea level rise. More so, what you don't see here is also our urban indigenous populations. So places like Boston, Washington, D.C., New York, these areas that are mega cities, urban environments around our planet that are actually already projected to be most impacted due to sea level rise events and extreme climate events. And in those urban spaces, we have the largest populations of indigenous peoples. So places like New York, Boston, Washington, D.C. So these are our territories of nations, but the vision of how sea level rise is impacting the eastern seaboard goes much, much farther beyond that. So some of the sea level rise impacts: increased flooding, permanent inundation, like I showed you earlier for my nation, wetland loss, migration issues, saltwater intrusion, drinking water contamination, cultural resource issues, as well as displacement. And I don't have time to go into all of these different concerns and impacts for our communities, but what drew me to some of this research initially was my core as being a water scientist. So I was really interested in the way in which sea level rise was impacting drinking water for tribal nations along the Atlantic coast. And so I'm just going to narrow in on that. So tribal nations face distinct challenges to water security, given these increasing sea level rise threats that I mentioned earlier. But we hear that, right? First Nations water crisis, Indigenous water crisis, tribal nation water crisis. Another word of the crisis. What does that mean in practice? Like what crises are individuals, households, communities facing? So when we started to look at the data and the projections and what these different types of modeling for sea level rise, inundation, what we started to see is, okay, so in terms of water security impacts, we're going to have infrastructure issues. You'll see in that much of this research is captured in a paper that it's open access, and you'll all have be able to scan in just a moment to read later. But for one of the nations, for Passamaquoddy, which is up in Maine, they had this wonderful water treatment facility that was put in, a drinking water facility that was put in, and it's about 200 yards from the coast. So it is immediately going to face inundation. It already floods. It already has issues around being impacted due to extreme events or high tides. So that's only going to continue to get worse and be exacerbated by sea level rise. So then we also have these moments of flooding or storm surge, and so where it's not something that is it can be both persistent, but the water is moving in and then moving out, and sometimes doing so with very, very short notice. On an extreme event, you can have projections of a storm surge that never comes, and you can sometimes have a storm surge that emerges that you can't even predict. And that's probably... Has anybody in this room experienced a storm surge before? No. So you go to bed at night and you're woken up probably at about 4 a.m, and about water that's about here is flowing in to your driveway or where your home is. And it's going to stay there and continue to rise for about a 12 to 16 hour period until the tide goes out. And then all of that water and all of the debris and everything that comes with it gets moved out or in. So there's ways that you can manage and mitigate and respond to that, but it's really dangerous, and it costs a lot of money to be able to respond and have the technology to respond. The other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, we have things like land loss. So there's the flooding that then leads to full inundation. So you can't, well, there's some innovative ways. Maybe some of you are exploring this about how to reclaim land. But if the land is lost to water, what do you do with it? Can you still use it for building? Can you put a house there? If you know that you've got now an area that's more flood prone than it was 20 years ago, do you put people there with their home? The other thing we have in coastal areas, anyone here live maybe out in the country, rural? Some of you, I think maybe some of you are renters a little bit. Have you heard of a cesspool or a septic? It's okay. So folks who are rural may have heard of that because it means you're not connected to a piped wastewater infrastructure. So we're going to talk about poop a lot today. So what that means is, how we've thought about building homes and buildings and all of this type of infrastructure is we take clean drinking water from the Great Lakes, not an unlimited resource, very finite resource, not the faucet that, so-and-so thinks it is. And we take clean drinking water and we use that clean drinking water to flush our poop. That's not going to help us in these impending crises that we have now and going into the future. In some parts of the world where we don't have wastewater connected through pipe systems, though that wastewater goes into a tank, a cement tank that's put into the ground, and then your piped infrastructure from your house will take that wastewater, put it into that tank, and let it basically kind of decompose over a period of time. There might be some filtration on it, and it either then also has to be extracted out and taken to another treatment facility by truck or tanker, and there's all these other things that come in with that. Or you have something, and that's generally called a cesspool, or you have something that is called a septic system or a septic treatment system. And that generally also has different tanks that your wastewater gets filtered through, and then some type of leaching pond or area that it is sort of cordoned to allow for it to be sort of reintegrated into the natural environment, to allow for reduction. In those tanks, there's a system to allow for the sort of pulling out of nitrogen-based material, because what we're trying to do is prevent the leaching of nitrogen and some of these pollution sources from getting into our water courses. What we're seeing, because that was sort of the new idea, is, okay, we want these septic systems, we want to get away from cesspools, because when you have a flood, that flood water takes everything in the cesspool and throws it everywhere. That's fun, right? You wake up, middle of the night, not only do you have 3 feet of water at your legs, but it's poop water. So, on these coastal spaces, in rural spaces, where we have these immense amounts of flooding events, we're trying to get away from cesspools. So we're thinking about septic systems, and the idea was to have nitrogen-reducing septic systems, multiple tanks where they could filter through, and then you have the leaching pond. Well, those aren't necessarily working either, and they're also being impacted by floods and storm surge. So we haven't figured out how to properly dispose of our poop, and nor have we figured out how to stop using drinking water to flush our poop. So these are things that maybe someone in this room will help us solve eventually. But the other thing that we see in terms of water security issues are we're having babies, which is wonderful. We have population growth. For First Nations, tribal nations, most of our population is under the age of 20. That means that we have very, very young populations and an exponential growth of our population in comparison to other populations in our countries. But what we've seen through colonization is we have growing populations, and growth through colonization and climate change decreasing land availability. So where do you put these people? Why do you think, well, there's many ways in which Indigenous peoples now live in urban centers. One was forced relocation, termination policies, but we also have now nowhere to go. We can't actually live on our existing territories, so we have to go elsewhere. And so there are all of these things that when you think about, oh, water security, you may not have actually thought about the compounding effects and stressors that communities are facing. So I don't want to leave you on doom and gloom. I want to leave you with, what do we do? Because I was like reading all of this as you are in your classes and hearing about crisis upon crisis upon crisis. And I'm like, okay, but we got to do something, right? Like, we've got this sea level, it's rising, we're experiencing all of these bad things. What are we going to do about it? And so you open up a book and you say, well, what do people do about sea level rise? So they have things called adaptation frameworks. We like to make frameworks in academia a lot. Frameworks and conceptual models and all of these different things. And this is the one that the IPCC in 2017 and 18 in their chapter on sea level rise said in the caption, generic model for sea level rise adaptation. And as David was astutely pointing out earlier, we have the white square box building. It does have a red roof, so that's kind of nice, a little color in there. But generally, there is this PARA mentality or framework for dealing with sea level rise. Planned retreat, accommodate, protect, which is hard or soft defenses, so stone walls, things like that. And then attack, which is land reclamation and development, so building out into the water, pushing the water away. Looked at that and I was like, well, that's not going to fly with my community. Try and sell that one to an elder. So I was like, well, then what's going on here? What is wrong? And I really saw some of the work, fortunately, from Marino and some scholars, including Hardy et al., who said, well, you really shouldn't be taking these adaptation frameworks and these conceptual models as gold. Just because someone says it's the thing to do, including the IPCC, doesn't necessarily make it so. What relations are they valuing? Whose knowledge system is being prioritized? And so Marino actually says a lot of the adaptation policies, the ways we think about disaster risk management, how we build homes, etc., are a form of adaptation oppression. We're just recycling the Western scientific intellectual colonialism and passing it on with like a new shiny red roof. And Hardy is saying, too, that this is what amounts to called colorblind adaptation planning. If you think, as David was saying earlier, that there is this thing called critical objectivity, that you can be objective, that there is a one-size-fits-all, what you're actually being is colorblind. And sometimes in being colorblind, you can actually be pretty racist. So what we started to take a look at then was to say, what's really going on here? If I want to bring this back to my community, would they be okay with this PARA acronym? And what we said was no. One, it's very militarized and combative. It's very gendered, right, when you also think about militarized language. It has no cultural connection, so there's no use of our language, there's no use of our design aesthetic, there's no indigenous design to the buildings, to what the water looks like, to, again, even any recognition of non-human beings in this framework. And so it's very human-centric. So we decided to come up with the Wampum Adaptation Framework. And so you can scan this QR code, it's open access, and what I will present in my last 5 minutes with you all is this framework idea. I'll know it's good to go when the phones are like slowly going down. Okay. So we have to think about design and relationality. So Indigenous design is rooted in our relationality. It's about how we respect water, how we respect the land, how we respect all beings, not just humans. And what we've seen historically is that architecture has often prioritized human needs, while Indigenous frameworks are really about how do we emphasize harmony, how do we think about how we live with the world. And one of the best ways I can think about this is we didn't have homes we stayed at all year round. We moved with the seasons. So particularly for my nation, we had different village sites at different times of year. So we had summer sites and we had winter sites because we learned to live with water. That's that idea about we have always lived with sea level rise, but we weren't confined to a single location as we are today. We had mobility, and that's a bit of where my work is going now, is this concept of mobility justice. It's largely been coined and discussed within the context of differently abled persons and how they're able to move through the world, but I think it also matters beyond that individual scale to communities. What does mobility justice mean? And how do we allow for that mobility in our design aesthetic? So how can architects and planners design with rather than against the environment? And you could replace the environment with water, with ocean, with sky, etc. So the framework that we put together, we used wampum because it's culturally relevant to our people. It's more than I can go through today. There's a wonderful book that I and colleagues just put out called Deo Hohage. It's about the two-row wampum, a wonderful edited volume, and you can really start to understand just how layered the experience of wampum as a relation is to who we are as Shinnecock people and the broader Haudenosaunee and Algonquin peoples of this region. So we used it as an acronym to stand for Witness, Acknowledge, Mend, Protect, Unite, and Move. And so for witness, it was witness warnings from human and non-human relations and follow the patterns of the natural world. And so for some of you in the fields of architecture, design, planning, you might see this come up in terms of biomimicry. I feel like that's something we always say, well, Indigenous people told you so. That's definitely something we've been doing for thousands of years, is this idea of learning from the natural world and building in response to that. I think it's also what David said earlier. It's not because we didn't realize we have all of these different resources. We were selective for our own preservation and survival, and so that we could thrive. It also is, A stands for acknowledge, which is acknowledge traditional teachings and restore cultural stewardship practices. So I didn't actually have a lot of, we could have so many conversations about this, but where I feel this is really important is understanding with many of the climate crises we're facing around water, around wildfires, drought, flooding, etc. Much of that is a symptom of the types of colonial, oppressive, and suppressive tactics that have been waged against us as Indigenous peoples. So this framework really builds out that we need to be able to reclaim those practices, cultural burning, for instance, land stewardship, planting, restoration of different types of adaptive and culturally important species. If we were allowed to do that and to reclaim that, then we wouldn't see as many of the crises that we're seeing in our world today. And so when we think about our built environment, imagining a built environment 5 years, 10 years, 100 years from now that isn't fearful of fire, that recognizes that there is good fire. And how do we build spaces that allow for that and lean into Indigenous peoples who have done that for centuries, if not millennia? So the next one is MEND, which is Mend the Shoreline and Practice Healing for Coastal and Environmental Sovereignty. And that really leads into, as you'll see here, leaning into our traditional ecological knowledge. So Shinnecock in our language means people of the stony shore. So after Superstorm Sandy hit our territory in 2013, we had massive erosion of our coastal shoreline. And so in the rebuilding process, what we actually did is we wound up rebuilding a living shoreline. We planted eelgrass. You can kind of see there in those shapes in the water. That is actually oyster seed beds to allow for shellfish that can help for wave reduction. And we also leaned into our name of people of the stony shore, and we repositioned boulders throughout our shoreline. Again, another way of reducing wave patterns onto that shoreline and preventing further erosion. And those are still going strong since 2013, so it's been a really good healing solution for us in our region. Same thing, the Pamunkey Indian tribe, they're like us. They are a coastal tribe, more interior in the river of the Chesapeake Bay of the Pamunkey River, but they are on a peninsula, so they're surrounded. And they've also implemented a living shoreline and started to work through some of those ideas about how do we restore land, restore shorelines by by practicing healing, right? Not trying to take something away or dredge or carve something out, but put things back. The next one is protect, which is protect future generations by protecting cultural sites and ancestors. And I think this is really about how do we think about resilience in Indigenous design. So resilience is not just about bouncing back, it's about adapting, thriving, and protecting future generations. And so we've practiced climate adaptation for millennia. It's why we're still here and still here in our ancestral territories for the Shinnecock for over 10,000 years. And we want to start to think about how can modern design principles start to integrate these principles that we've already had. Think about ways in which our design can really lead, right? And I don't really even necessarily like the word integrate, because it's less so of needing architects to come in and partner with us, but needing our own architects to do these things. So nothing about us without us. And I'd love to see more of that in 50 years' time. The next principle is unite with other communities to build capacity and plan for relocation. And this is really about acknowledging that many of our nations are, particularly along the Atlantic coast, are smaller nations. We have smaller land bases. And so to really have an impact politically and legally, it helps us to learn from one another, to unite and to build alliances as we have traditionally. And I think this also, as I've seen this framework be adapted, it's now cited in the New York Climate Assessment, the US Climate Assessment. Maybe when the IPCC comes back together, it'll be cited by them. I get tagged to share this framework all around the world. And so I think, I didn't design it with this intention of unite being about, it was to unite us as Native people together. But I do think there's space for allies in this principle, because I've seen it now in action. I think I didn't say it out loud because I hadn't seen it to date in action. I hadn't seen people really wanting to step up for us as Native people and want to see us succeed and not have to drown in place. But I'm seeing that shift and change, and so I think there's space for allies in this. The last principle is move, and it means move to new places with cultural connections and rebuild. A lot of times folks talk about managed retreat, and the M very well could have been managed retreat, but it also purposely wasn't, because we're not trying to retreat from our lands. We're not trying to actually leave our territories. I think it's more about how do we practice what we have done historically prior to colonization and zoning laws and building laws and needing to have formal structures so that family services doesn't come and take your kids. I think it's about this idea of, can we return to that space of relationality where we learn to live with water, where we don't have one singular place that's home, but home is about people. Home is about the planet. Home is about your relationships that you have with land and one another. And so moving then is not something that is harmful or scary or fearful or sad, but it's joyful. It is also unifying. You can't go anywhere in a canoe, our big canoes, our big machines. One person can't guide that canoe in the big ocean. You need many people together, rowing together in unison and as a collective. And so I think that is what this principle is really standing for. And so it's really taking all of these principles, the wampum framework, and seeing how we can start to address these issues that are facing our communities. How do we think about, if we aren't, this principle of move? Unfortunately, I have these big ideas, we have these big dreams, but we are hindered by ongoing colonialism. There are laws within the United States that we as tribal nations of the Eastern Atlantic cannot take new land into our tenure status. So we literally, legally, on the books, are confined to drown in place. So we do have to think about other ways to innovate, because the last principle, move, really isn't even an option for us. So can we elevate our structures? Can we find more adaptive structures? I've had great conversations with Professor English here and looking about how you might have more adaptive structures. Wastewater, please someone figure out how we can deal with poop. I would love that. And also, we also see these broader issues about lack of water infrastructure. And it's not just us as Native people. We have dilapidated, failing water and wastewater infrastructure systems across North America. And it's not really the system's fault. They weren't put in faulty. They're hundreds, if not 150 years old. They need to be maintained. They need to be updated. They need to be taken care of. You need to be in relation with your water system, Check that pipe. it's your relation. But we don't do that. We build something, we let it sit, we let it rot, and we complain when it fails. So what we learned from doing this work is that sea level rise presents increased risks to coastal communities with vast implications for regional security. And globally, sea level rise frameworks fail to include Indigenous peoples. So fortunately, unfortunately, this is the first Indigenous framework for adaptation to sea level rise. I don't want it to be the last. But I also have heard from folks, can we use your framework? And I'm like, well, you can be inspired by it, but unless you're from, coastal Algonquin, Wampum relational peoples, no, you really should be creating something that's localized and context specific. Using something that's quote unquote Indigenous without actually being local and in relation to the people that it's being used with is still being colorblind. It's still being racist. You're just tagging it with a prettier bow. So hopefully you all will think about that in your next steps. And what I thought was a good takeaway message for today is that P of the Wampum framework, protect, design for that 7th generation. Because if you haven't heard that phrase before, everything we do in our culture, we ask, is this action something that will support, that will allow for the health, the safety, the security, the ability to thrive of 7 generations from me today? And if it won't do that, or if it will harm them, we don't do those actions. We don't pursue that mineral extraction. We don't build that type of home. And so I think in the context of design, we need to have more 7th generation thinkers. Collaborate with Indigenous communities in design and planning. We need Indigenous locations, infrastructure built by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples. It's wonderful to see that, but I also, hear what David said earlier about we have to be careful about, even as Indigenous peoples, recolonizing ourselves, right? We need for these things that we create to have spirit, to be meaningful. And the only way you can do that is actually having conversations like tonight, being on the land, visiting with the water, with plant relatives, with animal relatives, seeing how they navigate. It's been really interesting for where I come from to see eagles come back to our territory after prolonged efforts of trying to reduce pollutants like DDT, et cetera, from our waters across Long Island. And now we start to see, well, where do they build their nests? Where do they go when they're not here? How might that also inform where we build, where we live, how we exist in these fluctuating spaces? So that is a part of what we think about nature-based solutions, right? Nature-based solutions aren't a carbon credit. They're not a financial incentive to build. Nature-based solutions are solutions that are for nature. And we as humans are part of nature. And ultimately, in the work that you do, especially if you're not Indigenous, you can have your work support land and water sovereignty efforts. You can have there be policies, zoning, practices in place where you ask the question, am I confining someone to drown in place? To burn in place? I mean, that's the question every LA planner is going to be asking for the next 20 years. If I build this home there, am I going to confine someone to be the next forest fire victim? So we have to design for that future. Consider the next 7 generations and every project from here out. Tabutni, thank you.
So we have a few minutes to have a conversation where I think, fleshing out some of the common themes will be extremely interesting. And I'm pretty sure that some of the students will have some questions as well, and particularly because Sorry?
Sorry, just so we can see a thing.
I know, we can't see. It's really actually, yeah, discombobulating, I have to say. It's very different from the lecture. Yeah, maybe that would be nice, yeah. But I just wanted to mention that we have students here tonight who are in the water program. And so I would like to give some time to be able to allow you to ask some questions so the conversation flows, you know, in the spirit of relationality and reciprocity, right? And I just wanted to say that I personally, I find this is a very interesting discussion today, like both of your talks, particularly for me as well, because it plugs right into some of the work I've been doing on care labor. And, you know, my work also, and this is the first time I've ever thought about this, is about a kind of mother relationship in some ways, right? And so it's kind of interesting to see how these discourses flow through, like, you know, kind of transcending boundaries and disciplines, schools, and practices. Like, it was very, very interesting for me. I do have some kind of general questions. I mean, one of the things I wanted to sort of linger on for a second is just really thinking about the power of this idea of the relational and reciprocity. One of the ways that I came to this work actually was listening to an interview actually with Robin Wall-Kimmerer, and she was talking about cultivating and sweetgrass, and how she had 3 different, you know, they were kind of looking at harvesting patterns, like is it better to harvest sweetgrass by picking handfuls, or just letting it go wild? And it didn't matter which traditional harvesting method was used, but they found that it thrived when it was being harvested, that it actually needed this kind of relational element. It needed humans. And so I just, you know, for me, actually, in these dark times, it's something I've been thinking a lot about, is the power of relationality and of reciprocity as a kind of, like a really, really fundamental paradigm shift, quite frankly. So I wanted to express my gratitude to both of you for making that the sort of central focus today. I think maybe it would be nice, in the spirit of relationality, to see if the students first, or the audience members, have any comments or questions, and particularly because one of the things that David mentioned was this question of how we teach, and some of the, you know, the new roles we might have as educators in these dark times, quite frankly, and maybe we can't do this without you, you know. And so let's turn it, see if you have any questions, and then we can continue the conversation. It takes a minute sometimes, I understand, yeah.
Okay, so hi, my name is Audrey. I really appreciated your lecture. I really enjoyed the quote that you put in about how, like, the environmental problems are selfishness, greed, apathy, and to deal with that you need to do a lot of cultural transformations kind of towards community. I was wondering, like, as a lot of our current systems are failing and a lot of our social infrastructural, like, structures, how would you, like, see that evolving and see, like, the community be really the true focus of city building and general, like, architecture?
You seem to have just one mic somehow.
Right. Go for it.
I'll just start since I put that quote up. So I think, like, answering that question that Dean asked for me is really at the root of what the reason why I'm very interested in education. Because unfortunately, I don't want to say that people can't change. We can all change. But we've been trained in a certain way to think that is very difficult to shake from right now, right? Like, systemically, the world, everything you've talked about, the kind of selfishness, greed, apathy thing, it's obviously not just architecture, it's a problem. I will say, like, what I think about a lot, and those that take my 3B studio would know that I, over the last decade, have totally changed the way I teach smaller groups of students, for instance. This is the kind of goes into this idea of what the design lodge would be. But there's this relationship between ethical behavior, if we kind of, just universally, what creates, so a friend of mine from the University of Edinburgh, actually, he's Greek, but he was very interested in Greek philosophy. But he was talking about, in his PhD, that there's a direct correlation between ethics and habits, habitual relationships. And if you think about it, so ceremony for First Nations people is critical to the positionality, that spiritual and cultural transformation. The people that I know that hold those teachings, they typically do ceremony, whether that be sweat lodge or whatever that is. Ceremony can be as small as putting tobacco down and being thankful for the material that you're using. When you form that as part of your habits in life, you're starting to transform this problem that we've got, that detachment of the iceberg that I showed, right? You think about it, it's not, I grew up very Roman Catholic. My parents are very Christian Catholics, right? I'm sure many of you come from similar homes. Well, every Sunday, people go, why do people go to church every Sunday? It's because it's a reaffirmation of your values and your faith and the systems of thinking, right? It doesn't matter, any faith-based group here will do the same thing. If you're doing, and so I don't want to get all make people squirmy, but that's part of what I said up there, is to make people squirmy. When you say prayer for people, that means something. That's not like an empty act. And I do think generally secularized society has tried to kind of remove that as being, it's all hokey pokey. That doesn't really, that doesn't really mean anything. Native people blowing their smoke pipes or whatever, right? It's all kind of witchery, those sorts of things. I really don't believe that. And I really think at the root of that problem that Dr. Speth wrote about is we've got a problem that we actually have lost we've lost our patterns of routine that remind ourselves of those ethical foundations of who we are and the value systems we have. So just as an example, and it's a mini one, I learned it from an elder in Laurentian. Every Monday morning we get the studio group. I know I'm teaching you guys, you're gonna all be like, why don't we do this? But you're too big of a group, but you do a sharing circle. It's a very simple thing. And you go around the room and everybody in our studio says, I played with my cat this weekend, or, we had a meal and we went out together and watched a movie or whatever. And you think, well, what's that got to do with architecture? We're spending 45 minutes of our class time talking about these. But that elder told me that's really important, because each one of your lives is very important. And it might be some week that somebody comes in that Monday morning talk in our studio and says, I had a really crappy week. My grandmother got really sick. I'm not myself, I haven't slept well for 3 days, and that's been shared with the group now, right? So now, when it comes to Wednesday, and maybe that person didn't get their drawing done as part of the group is like, oh yeah, well, we know what they're going for, we're here to support you. It's unbelievable in my own teaching, the impact that has had in studios, by the end of the studio. It's not like I'm competing against you for a better grade. My drawing's nicer than your drawing, right? That's the way I was trained. The 90s, people used to actually sabotage other students' models, if you can believe it. That was a thing in architecture schools. They would go and somebody had a nicer model, they'd sabotage them. I think it's an extreme case, but there are these stories, right? Where they're saying, we're all to your point, we're sent that you're unite, right? How do we find this space? And we're all here to help each other out. We're a group of people, we're just trying to move forward in a good way together. So anyways, I bring it down, it's a very long answer to say, to me, the answer to this question is asking yourself, what habits are you forming that help you ground yourself? And there are infinitely many ways to do that, and you all have it in you.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer, and I think the only thing I would add is sometimes we don't know the habits that we hold. I see that a lot in the context of water, and when I teach students about water, or policymakers or government leaders about water, I'm like, well, have you logged your interactions with water in the past 24 hours? How many times did you flush the toilet? How long was your shower? Did you use it to cook? Did you use it to drink? And a lot of people, they can't even remember what was the last time they had an interaction with water. And so I think that's a bit of, you are able to be self-indulgent, you're able to have apathy when you don't actually think about your habits, when the habits just become all consuming and just, you ignore those things about yourself. And so it's a bit about being able to know more of ourselves and know how we exist in this world rather than just kind of pushing through 9 to 5, you know. Has anybody, it is 9 to 5 with Dolly Parton, right? And you see them all like, you know, it's the 80s, but it's sort of that idea where they're all sort of coming into the buildings with their briefcases and just like rushing through the time, you know, the time of the busyness and the business. And we've just been conditioned to exist like that as a global society, and we just keep doing it and keep doing it in social media and technology. It just makes it even worse. And so sometimes it's just taking a moment to pause. You know, the other thing that elders are great. So if you don't have an elder in your life, maybe that's a good place to start, is finding one. And they will often say, when you are feeling out of sorts, go outside, take your shoes off, and put your feet on Mother Earth. That will be a regrounding practice. To then just ask yourself, how am I feeling? Why am I feeling that way? What could I do to rebalance how I exist in the world? So, and then the other thing I'll say, because I can't go anywhere without sharing this, is that I've probably been in all of your shoes at one point where I was like, this world's doomed, crisis, like I'm just gonna go ostrich and bury my head in the sand. And so I had the fortunate ability to sit with some Indigenous grandmothers over the course of my PhD work. And I would ask them, I was like, do you have any hope for politicians, our planet, you know, their ability to fix these water issues that we're seeing? And every single one of them said no. And it was just this like short but really powerful answer of no. But somewhere in the process of these conversations, I said, well, do you have hope for anything? Like, is there any morsel of like that my life is worth still like existing in this space? And they said, little ones. And particularly in the context of water, they said they're still close enough to that natal connection, that birth of water nurturing them in that womb for 9 months. So our JK, our toddlers, those sort of 1 to 5-year-olds, they're so close to that water connection, they haven't had it severed by our global society. So they said if we can nurture that connection, can nurture it through education, perhaps we might have a world 7 generations from now that would value water, that would value our planet, that would value design in a different way. And so I do try and, you know, oftentimes they don't think about a water scientist being committed to education. Yes, we teach you all at university levels, and I hope you're not lost causes, but sometimes, you know, you've already been conditioned. You exist in the world. I do try now to have more of my work reach little ones. So if you have little ones in your lives, it doesn't have to be children, but parents, children of yourselves. Well, sometimes parents act like little ones, so maybe. But if you've got children or sisters or brothers or cousins, or there's a local school in your area that you can give back to, it's a really great place to make an impression.
Okay, we have one more question that I think we can have time to take.
I was just wondering, so sorry, my voice, I don't know what happened there. In wampum, the acronym, the last item, well, I assume it's like a cyclical system, but the last item in the acronym is moving. And as that has like a lot of historical presence with like seasonal movements within Indigenous peoples in Turtle Island, but it also has like a colonial history with Indigenous people in displacement. I was wondering if, like, obviously there's the issue of getting more land and being able to move your territory like legally, but is there also any like I guess, not resentment, but like pushback in the community because of this displacement that's happened fairly recently within the grand scheme of things. And like personally, I hate moving. So like I like to be able to go on the same hikes and have like the same people and have the same habits and go to the farmer's market every Saturday and stuff like that. So I was just wondering like what kind of like how you can like promote moving, and obviously it might vary region to region what is required, like you said, but how is like movements actually like productive? And
yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think that principle is the one that is so difficult for folks to navigate. And sometimes when a framework is created, it's to inspire conversation and questions like this. So there are community members that will not move, but the operative word there is their will. It's their inherent right as an Indigenous person to have that right of self-determination, to make the choice. What the principle is arguing for is that right of self-determination has been removed and stolen from us to even have the choice of whether we move or we don't move. And so it's there to push back about supporting Indigenous sovereignty movements for that right of choice. But yes, there are definitely folks that don't want to move, and in the context of displacement, it is very traumatizing and re-traumatizing when you get to that principle. My hope is that we actually never have to get to the M. That all the other principles, if put in place, make it so that the M maybe doesn't need to be operationalized, perhaps, or it's operationalized in those more self-determined practices. But that's also why I say the wampum framework is localized and context-specific, because for the Eastern Atlantic nations that it's made for, we all exist on our ancestral Aboriginal territory. We were never displaced. Our land was just diminished. And so that's also really important too, is we weren't forcibly relocated. We never lost our land. It's just slowly been taken away from us. And so that other aspect too, on the principles, it says move to places with cultural connection. So there are places, 500 yards away from our reservation border that are above sea level. The peninsula that we live on is below sea level. But we can't access that because our neighbors are the Hamptons. And so that land, one, has Hampton folks who don't want to be removed from stolen land, but two, is some of the most expensive real estate in the world. So, very complicated, but a great question. I'm glad I got to expand on it more.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also a great question. I wrote down my book when she was talking about mobility, and I was thinking about the same thing, just in terms of like migration, just globally, right? Like if we look around the room, like my European ancestors from my mom's side came in the early 1900s. Even my Métis family in the prairies, if I look, I love genealogies, so looking back and seeing, where they came from, but they were moving all over from Manitoba to Saskatchewan, northern Alberta, some people Northwest Territories for hundreds of years. It's like nobody stayed anywhere for more than 2 generations. So it's like, and I often think about this in the context of land relations, like this question of like, how do I say this in a short way? An Ojibwe teacher years ago talked about that animals in their territory understand Ojibwe. Which he's like, people think that's crazy, but he's like, think about it. It takes your dog like 2 months to understand how to say sit. They've been listening to Ojibwe for thousands of years. Those animals, we know how to communicate with them in our language. And I remember thinking, of course, that makes sense, right? And the languages themselves are so important. So you talk about habits and forming habits. Like I often think about Anishinaabe, and I think I might have mentioned this to you guys before, but understanding bits of that language, like the phonetics of that language, remind you about the land consistently, like the sound b. It's in a whole bunch of words. It's in women, it's in spirit, because it's water. So whenever you talk about a woman, you're going to hear water in your ear, and just by using that sound, you remind yourself all of the time the sacredness of water. Our language doesn't remind us about the sacredness of anything, right? So like I have to think about that as a migrant sitting here speaking as an Anglophone. I'm not from this region. What was lost about the relations with these lands by not speaking Anishinaabe or all those languages? So like this idea of moving, and then how do you land in a territory in a respectful way, going back to the land acknowledgement. I actually think one of the detriments is that we don't have the tools to fully build that relationship. We can aspire to it, but it takes time and effort, and the things you talked about, right? Wanting to go on the walk on the same place, getting to know that place. You've built a relationship with places. In a mobile world, I mean, I have a theory, and I know everybody's getting tired by now, it's been a long day, but I don't want to sound like a super radical person here, but I often talk about capitalism needs us. It needs us to be detached from place. It needs us to be alienated. If you think about like in our homes, the private rooms, which was never part of Indigenous cultures, in anybody's cultures around the world, the idea that and guilty as charged, my daughters both cried it out because we were exhausted and needed sleep, right? The idea of putting a child in a crib and closing the door and saying, you're on your own. What's that message say, right? It's like, oh, I guess I got to figure out myself. And we celebrate kids for being individuals. You got to get the best grade, be the best team. It's all about competition. Why? So that by the time you get to grade 12, you're going to have the best grades, and you're going to apply to go to school in Waterloo, thankfully, to have you all here, right? Well, that probably for many of you means you're moving a step away from your family, from your kin, and the relationships and those paths that you walked your dog on as a kid. Now you're somewhere else. And this is a world thing. I'm not saying migration is all bad. But then you get done your degree here, and the next thing is going to be, oh, why did I want that scholarship so bad? So I can get the best job. Okay, where am I going to go? Oh, it's going to take me to New York now. I'm going to go to New York or London. And now you got to land there, and you're in a different context with a different group of people, right? And then it's like, oh, I'm going to get a raise, or I'm going to go somewhere else. And that attitude, which I'm as guilty as anybody on, it's constantly keeping you alienated from the landscape. And what are you basing your decisions on? Because every step of the way, you're getting further away from your grannies and your aunties. In matriarchal societies, those are the people that can guide you in your thinking. You're getting a step further away from everybody until the point that you've lost all those habitual teachings. So mobility is good. I think it's good. We all should learn from each other. But I think the question for me is always like, how do you land? And really land. If we all really landed, or if we could land in this world during these dark times, we would understand. Like the elders when they speak. It's just, I don't know. I hope you guys all have that experience, and you probably have your own grandparents in your lives and these things. Like all these crises, you come in like in a panic mode, and just to see the calmness on their face, and they're just kind of like, it's the teachings are here. The teachings are there to guide you. You can work through this. So anyways, I think I loved your question because I think about it a lot in terms of moving around and like you said, the 9 to 5 is such a good example. Like just getting bombarded by emails and literally just trying to survive to get through your day every day. It's how do I stay connected?
So I actually really hate to do this, but I feel like everybody needs to eat dinner. Pizza was not quite enough. But just on behalf of us and on behalf of the lecture series, I want to thank you both for this conversation. And I think Jane and I both see this as the beginning of many conversations like this, and hopefully we can invite you back for even a larger discussion with more of the community. So thank you.